Okay, it's a lot of information, it's easy to get lost, so what do we have up to this point in the timeline? We have the Eternal Cities going to the Shadow Realm as colonizers, pretending to work with the shamans all the while planning to betray them, but the shamans went behind their backs, and along with the serpent, they summoned Grace and ascended one of the grandmothers as the Formless Mother, and started oppressing the Hornsent and the Cursed Blades during the Golden Crucible, but then the Hornsent used the Ruined Forges to revolt against the Shamans, who then moved to the Eternal Cities from where the original colonizers had come from. So they went to the homeland of the Hornsent and married into the bloodline from where the Hornsent had originally come from. And they established their royal bloodline there, but then they eventually cut short the Patriarchal Society, established the new Matriarchal Society, which eventually led to America, going back to the Shadow Realm, from where the shamans had been expelled from. Okay, that is a cycle, with cycles inside of it. And now we're finally ready for the Crusades. Fuck yeah.
Hello, everybody. So we're back for part 2 of the Shadow of the Erdtree timeline, and getting right back into it, we're gonna start talking about the Crusade, and we're going to start with the basics. So, considering that the Crusaders are described as the people of the Erdtree, and the fact Mesmer's timeline overlaps with Radahn's through the remembrance of the Wild Boar Rider, then Marika's return and Mesmer's crusade would have happened after she had already taken over the Erdtree, and after Radagon had married Renala. Also, considering the One Ring theory, which I have explained before a number of times, then Marika's return and Mesmer's crusade would have happened before she had brought Farum Azula to ruin and usurped the Elden Ring proper from the Glowmite Queen. And as a quick side note, like, giving this timeline and Mesmer's red hair and just his twink physical build, then Radagon is probably his father. And in regards to the specifics of the crusade itself, the first step for it is, of course, getting to the Shadow Realm. And I believe that, just like the explorers of the Eternal Cities had done before, Marika also called upon the assistance of Metyr in order to get there. Like, when Ymir talks about Marika, he says Marika herself and the fingers that guided her. A phrasing that might lead one to believe he's talking about the more general kind of guidance that the two fingers of the Round Table hold would have offered her. But given that he's literally sitting on... Can you hear the fucking birds? But given that he's literally sitting on top of a portal leading to Metyr, who had originally quote-unquote guided the Eternal Cities explorers to the Shadow Realm, then his choice of words, well, it may be a little bit more literal than that. The guidance he is referring to might be the literal kind of guidance of leading you somewhere, a meaning that is also present in the Japanese version, and just as a cross-reference, the kanji used in Japanese here is the same kanji used when Lida, for instance, talks about the Tarnished being guided by kindly Miquella to the Shadow Realm. So that sets a precedent for the meaning of the word. At least the meaning is possible, the possibility is there. Especially when you consider that Marika is the literal vessel to the Elden Ring, and arguably has a much more reliable line of communication with Grace than the broken and discarded fingers of the Hold, right? Like, The Elden Ring is literally inside her body. This implies she should be able to communicate with Grace directly and wouldn't really need the guidance of the two fingers. Like, the two fingers are a proxy for the masses. They're a useful tool to communicate the will of the greater will to her followers, but Marika herself wouldn't need that kind of guidance. Okay, the possibility is there, but how do we actually reach that conclusion that Marika used Metyr to reach the Shadow Realm? Well, there are 3 finger ruins in the Shadow Realm: Raya, Dio, and Mir. As previously theorized, the underground ruins of Mir were built by the colonizers in order to communicate with their home base in the lands between and Metyr herself. But besides being on the surface instead of underground, Raya and Dio are set apart by the fact that sounding their hanging bells rewards the player with seed talismans, whose descriptions directly tie them to the Erdtree, which is a kind of weird little characteristic, right, for those ruins. The game kind of nudges the player into considering the possibility that the origin for the fingers in general is these ruins in the Shadow Realm, right? Like, there's that spirit of the Horn Saint that studies the fingers, and he's like, aha, I found it, I found the origin of the fingers, I knew it, they're coming from the ruins. But like, the Remembrance of Metyr explicitly states that Metyr, the mother of fingers, fell on the lands between, not the Shadow Realm. That's the point of origin for the fingers. And G's Horn Saint, like, he doesn't have access to that information. He's just studying that particular instance of fingers that he has access to. So now we have the origin of the fingers in the lands between, but the ruins are in the Shadow Realm, and if these fingers were associated with the original explorers from the Eternal Cities, then why would these bells be giving you Erdtree talismans? Well, they wouldn't be, right? But the connection is there. It's a very clear and explicit connection between these ruins and the Erdtree. So we need to explain that. Well, in the wake of her rebellion, Marika would have slain the two fingers of the Divine Towers. Like, there's a bunch of Divine Towers, there's a bunch of two fingers up there, and they're dead, and we don't know how long they have been dead for, right? But if they served the Glowmite Queen, like the Glowmite Queen ruled over the entire continent, and the towers would have been under her control as well. I've explained the towers before, like, they have no references to Grace. They have that molten core, molten meteorite core with 8 smaller meteorites around it that are the exact same pattern from the eye of the Fell God in the body of the Fire Giant. And yeah, so these fingers on the towers, they served the Glowmite Queen. So when Marika took over the surface, she killed those fingers. But the two fingers of the Hold and the Karen fingers, they survived. The fingers of the Hold were serving under Marika and Grace, and presumably she may not have had access to the Karen fingers at the time. But then, by the time of the Crusade, Radagon had already married Renala, so Marika would have had access to the Carians through Radagon. And like, the finger ruins in the world map, they're dotted with like blue and gold specks, I guess you'd call it. And they reward Cerulean and Crimson talismans, right? The seed talismans. But it's worth noting that the golden dotted ruins of Dio reward the Cerulean talisman, while the Cerulean dotted ruins of Raya reward the Crimson talisman. It's kind of a hint more than a piece of evidence, but the inverted pattern there between the color association in the map and the color of the talismans that are rewarded in each location. They kind of do hint at a collaboration between these two fingers, the round table fingers and the carrion fingers. And like I said, Marika would have had access to the carrions at this time, at this period. And Relana and a host of carrions are present in the Shadow Realm and aligned with Mesmer, which gives us another instance of collaboration between the carrions and Marika's forces. And like, besides being on the surface instead of underground, besides giving you seed talismans that are directly linked to the Earth Tree, besides this dynamic of gold and blue and the precedent set by the collaboration between Relana and Mesmer, there's also the coffins from the Wandering Mausoleums. Yes, the coffin from the Wandering Mausoleums that duplicate remembrances and that can be found in all of the finger ruins in the Shadow Realm. Like, they also help to confirm this ancient/modern dichotomy that is present in these three ruins. Like, the Mir ruins would have been more ancient, built by the explorers, and Dio and Raya would have been more recent, built by Marika's forces. Like, the coffins are on the ruins in Raya and Dio, but not at Mir. At Mir, the coffin is on the surface, but the ruins are underground, which implies that the placement of these coffins is a more recent development when compared to the timeline of Mir itself, which in turn implies Raya and Dio are more recent than Mir, right? So just like Metyr would have helped the Eternal Cities explorers sail to the Shadow Realm, the Two Fingers duo from the Round Table and the Carians, they would have contacted Metyr in Marika's stead and asked Metyr to help her forces reach the Shadow Realm too. Like, we have talked about the Eternal Cities as a seafaring people in part 1, but Marika also has that tradition, I guess. Like, she sent Godfrey away on ships, right? There are shipwrecks on the coast of the Weeping Peninsula to this day. They had the capability to do that. They had the capability to sail out and make use of Metyr's portals in order to reach the Shadow Realm. And once there, they built the ruins to facilitate contact with Metyr and all the processes, especially in case of an emergency, I guess. But yeah, the whole framework is there, and I personally think there's no reason not to believe that Marika used Metyr in order to reach the Shadow Realm, just like the others had done before. When it comes to the reasons that would lead Marika to do a crusade at all, the two most obvious reasons that are presented by the game would be either revenge against the Hornsent for what they did to the shamans and or the containment of the Base Serpent and the Felflame. They're right there on the surface, you can just look at the DLC and that's what the game wants you to believe. But neither of these makes actual sense, though, when you look into it. I mean, containing the serpent and the flame doesn't make sense when you consider first that the serpent was never ascended, that it was already contained and no longer a threat, and that keeping Mesmer around wouldn't be that bad, given that cursed children are acceptable as long as they're able to keep up appearances to some extent, such as the twins Mikkel and Malenia, who are allowed to carry their respective Rotten and Jane Z looking divine asses around. And second, that Marika kept a fire giant alive with the explicit purpose of tending to the Felflame, which she also meant to use as part of her plans down the line anyway. And revenge doesn't make sense when you consider that, well, Marika doesn't seem to have any fucks left to give for anybody. She just doesn't care. She had both her husbands killed, she sacrificed her own children, and she was willing to let her whole kingdom be torn apart by war, all for the sake of advancing the goals of her ruling outer god. Making just a quick real-life reference here, but when fascists try to show you their quote-unquote good side, you should remember Hans Liedem saying, "Don't listen to him, he's telling the truth. Ye will be forsaken, amounting only to sacrifices," she said. "Wage motherfucking war and brandish the goddamn Elden Ring." That was her command. No. The most likely reasons for the crusade were to expand the sphere of influence of the outer god of grace, with a possible secondary purpose of trying to contain the Formless Mother instead. Like, they can use the Horn Scent and the Fell Flame in their speeches, but when you look at the evidence, like, we know grace expands its power to other worlds, which is indicated by the many Erdtrees in the Elden Beasts arena, and we know that they're growing Erdtrees in the Shadow Realm. That's just what they're doing. There's no room for interpretation here. And, unlike Mesmer, who's allowed to figuratively wave both the serpent and the flame around in his banner, in the literal banner of the crusade, and then literally wave the flame around while burning people to death, like, that's not containing much, is it? But instituting the Barrier of Thorns at the Tower of Belurath was an actual act of containment. They didn't bother containing the whole tower, just the upper half, where the Gate of Divinity is located. And the gate was used to summon grace in the past, yes, but now that grace is already here, then it's no longer a useful tool. Now the gate is just a ticking time bomb. Grace wants powers to be added to the Elden Ring, but I don't really suppose Grace would want a new Outer God rising to contest its power, like Miquella does, especially considering that the Formless Mother is still out there. They contained the Serpent, that was easy, the Serpent wasn't an Outer God, but the Formless Mother, she's still out there, and she's committed a couple of deicides in the past already. And that was fine when killing gods was useful for grace, but now that's just a death-threatening liability. So now we have two much more clear reasons for the crusade, but going back to the Horn Scent, Marika is a direct descendant of the Shamans, yes, but she's also eons removed from them. And there are two instances in-game that would seem to indicate that Marika cared for the Shamans, but they're both actually misleading you into thinking that. The first one is the Infirmary Ward of the Shadowkeep. Inside the Shadowkeep there's that room that looks like an infirmary, there are beds with bodies on them, and there are pots and shamans walking around, which makes it look like Marika was trying to heal the shamans, right? But the crusade was a violent purge, and the perfumers were not called here to heal, right? The perfumers are the healers. We see that happening in Leyndell, in the Lands Between, but in regards to the crusades, they were explicitly not called there to heal. And if you look beyond the beds and the stretchers, you may also notice that there is a corpse holding the Wall of Sparks, Ash of War, overlooking the room, which indicates they were ready to burn the whole thing down if they had to. There are even perfume bottles hanging from the ceiling, waiting to be dropped on the shamans below. All perfume bottles we get are weapons. They're all weapons meant to kill. You have a guy there with a finger on the trigger, just staring at this powder keg contraption hanging from the ceiling, waiting to burn the shamans Marika was supposed to care for down to the ground. Big spark goes fucking boom. So under this light, she wasn't trying to heal them, She was trying to convert them. She was literally trying to open their eyes and force them to see their way into salvation with irises of grace. Praise the Lord! So the bedridden, mangled corpses indicate more an attempt to make them, presentable, rather than actually heal them. And you have the irises of grace there to force them into seeing grace. And you have, I think it's a battle priest cookbook there as well. And they were trying to spread the word of the Earth Tree. So the shamans were only worth saving if they could convert. Otherwise, burn them. No fox left to give. And when all that failed, she just abandoned them. The keep is still under Mesmer's control, but there's no one there tending to the shamans. The failsafe guy with the wall of sparks is dead, so he can't pull the trigger anymore, and the shamans are just content with walking in circles, I guess, confined to their quarters and not warranting the attention of the keep's seclusive lord. Literally no fox left to give. And still in the topic of shamans inside jars, there's Bonny Village, where the greater potentates there, they look unhorn saint-like, right? Their skin tone, even their physique, they just don't look like horn scent. And they do have those budding horns on their heads when you look at them, but their masks have horns, so it's hard to tell whether those are from the masks or from them. So what I'm saying is that they may not be horn scent at all and may have been working for the crusade all along. Like, Bonny Village is in the backyard of the keep, and the keep has easy access to it if Marika cared about any of the shamans, or even if they were a slight kind of threat, the keep could just squash them. They could just end the village for good altogether right now, but they don't. They're just standing there. And it's also worth pointing out that the Lands Between also has potentates and a tarnish-eating finger maiden who wields the same kind of weapon the greater potentates employ. So yeah, Marika may have taken over the shaman pickling production line in order to use it for her own goals. So that's pickled up shamans, but when it comes to their customs, their traditions, which is another point that might give you the impression that Marika cared about the shamans, the Earth Tree may tacitly tolerate the endurance of the Shaman's festival, but it's worth noting that political leaders are often the least fanatical believers among the faithful. Like, heresy is condoned under Marika's rule, so long as it serves her purposes. You know, this is not exclusive to the shamans, this is not exclusive to the festival. Case in point, there's the gravel stone seal that you get in Leyndell, you know? The description says, the worship of the ancient dragons does not conflict with belief in the Earth Tree. After all, this seal and lightning itself are both imbued with gold. I mean, come on. Right? Like, this is the flimsiest, funniest excuse to condone heresy I have ever seen. I mean, sure, we're a grace-based religion and political system, and we have fought a bitter war against the lightning-wielding ancient dragons, but, you know, they're both yellow, so it's fine, If it makes it easier for the Glomide Queen's Dragon Knights to quote-unquote convert to Marika's faith and serve as watchdogs in her golden capital, then so be it. Heresy is fine. And back to the festival, like, it's a shamanic practice. It shouldn't be compatible with the Earth Tree, but it's tolerated. And if not for sentimental reasons, then how does that help the Earth Tree? Well, The recipe for the festive grease is found in a battlefield priest's cookbook, so it was used by devout battlefield priests who fought bitterly to spread their gospel in the realm of the shadow, where there was no earth tree to gaze upon. Like, it creates cultural common ground with some of the locals they hope to convert, and its usage by Marika's forces provides also an extra incentive for the Crusaders to, well, indulge in acts of war. Right? If you give them access to this grease, to these practices, then the more quote-unquote enemies they kill, the more runes they get. And now, with all that being said, we finally get to the main piece of the image rehabilitation campaign floated by From Software at the behest of Queen Marika, the Eternal, the Shaman Village. When you walk into the village, everything is peaceful and serene, flowers, golden light, white doves. Then, through the minor earth tree incantation, you find out that Marika bathed the village of her home in gold, knowing full well that there was no one to heal. And through the golden braid, you learn that Marika made an offering to the Grandmother. But what was her prayer? Her wish? Her confession? There is no one left to answer, and Marika never returned home again. Very sad, heart-wrenching, tear-dropping. But within the context we have just established, this scenario, well, it takes on a whole different light, doesn't it? If she doesn't care about the shamans, or anybody else for that matter, then showering the village in golden light must have been done for a reason other than honoring their memory. And the reason for her to have done it is in the name of this very same spell. You pick up the spell, the minor earth tree spell, at a tree growing in the middle of the village, and there are minor earth trees being cultivated in other locations as well. The tree is the point of it. The Skado tree is going to die, and the Shadow Realm is going to get a proper earth tree of its own, which will be added to the collection seen in the Arena of the Elden Beast. The Grandmothers had summoned Grace to the Shadow Realm to begin with, yes, but one of them literally became the Formless Mother, and the dynamics present in the lands between indicate the worship of Grace was secondary for them, as seen in the influence of the Bloodstars surrounding Morgwyn's palace and the lack of a proper worship of Grace during the classical era of the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Not to mention the blood-soaked, blade-licking villagers of the Windmill Village, if that's an indication of their original festive ways. Marika failed to convert the shamans in the infirmary, so she's converting the village instead. Marika is literally planting her new order on the desecrated soil of her forebears, and the minor earth tree she planted there is her figurative middle finger to the memory of her ancestors. And then there's the braid. First, let's remind ourselves that this was an offering to the Grandmother, with a capital G, not her grandmother, and the fact that there are multiple grandmother statues, meaning this was more likely a title given to leaders of their matriarchal society and isn't meant to reflect any actual familial bonds here. This wasn't Marika's grandmother, this was a grandmother. Then, the fact Marika never returned home again is supposed to mean she was too sad, but if she doesn't care, then that's all that means. She doesn't care, so she never went back again. And we're misled into feeling sorry enough for her that we would assume her prayer was something like, "I love you, Granny, I fucked up all the horny people for you. You can rest in peace now. Here, take some grace." But the item's description explicitly states there's no way of knowing. So, given the context laid out thus far, I'd personally find it more probable for her to have said something along the lines of,
Fuck you and your blood-sucking formless mother, you old wooden hag. Here, take some fucking grace. Hallelujah. Like, like, it's spite. You know, like, you worship that fucking weirdo outer god of blood. I'm grace given, motherfucker. Here, take some. You want some fun with my fucking hair? It's golden now. Can you look at it? It used to be red. My head is golden now, bitch. Take some fucking grace. Yes. Okay. We just went for this with Michaela, people. Okay.
Okay, now we have a better sense of why America may have conducted the crusade and how she may have gotten started with it, like literally started by how she went to the Shadow Realm. And when it comes to the crusade, the game doesn't seem to have much lore in regards to the fighting itself, like Miquella's assault on Celia, Town of Sorcery. The game provided a lot of lore about that, about the conflict itself. When it comes to America's Crusade, the fighting seems to be just mostly what you see in the trailer, honestly. But there's a lot of politicking going behind the scenes, stuff like that. And that's what we're gonna get into, right? Because they didn't just conquer, they did a divide and conquer. Now, both the Hornsent NPC and the Imperial Grandam mention America's betrayal of their clan, meaning the people of the Erdtree didn't come as invaders at first. There was a period of partnership between America and the Hornsent. You know, just like with the Serpent and the Duelist set in the Lands Between, in order for you to betray somebody, first you need to be their friends. And signs of a America/Hornsent alliance include crusade banners with the spiral motif and the one ring depicted as a spiral in a circle, the tree worship sanctum built to give the outward appearance of allowing Scadu tree worship, with one ring and winged serpent ornamentations built into the architecture of the Shadow Keep, indicating it was built by America, and the sanctum having been since cut off by the flooding of the church district, and several instances of Shadow People/Hornsent implied to have worked with Messmer's forces, such as the Lava Intake Spirit NPC who says by grace, various Hornsent bodies with runes given to Crusaders and rune arcs, the Shadow Soldiers and Scholars in the Shadow Keep, and even the golden garments of the Grandam herself. This dynamic of friendship/betrayal can also be seen in the Impenetrable Thorn spell, which says the image of the twisted Scadu tree is an edict. Denounce their ways, do them harm, for they have abandoned us. Spiral-shaped pairs of trees can be found and seem to be given reference, such as the one in the plaza in the Tower of Belurat where Quilline invades you, indicating that this Scadu tree used to be more spiral-shaped, like it's bent out of shape now, it seems to be falling over itself, but it probably used to be like those spiral-shaped trees, which contextualizes the quote-unquote twisted form mentioned in the spell, and explaining the spiral motif in general. And considering the Barrier of Thorns of the Tower of Belurat was instituted by the people of the Erdtree, since the Grandam says our tower by thy kind veiled in shadow, and that Impenetrable Thorns is associated with gold and shadows, then all these symbolize those who have abandoned them, as per the spell's description. America came back not as a shaman, but a goddess. She enticed them with the prospect of divinity and reintroduced the worship of both Shadow and Grace to the Shadow Realm. In the first hint to this prospect of divinity she dangled in front of them, it's worth noting that the existence of said Grandam implies they were supposed to have Empyreans of their own. Now, they were supposed to have Empyreans, but there are no characters explicitly stated to be the Empyrean counterpart in the Shadow Realm. However, the tutelary deities should fill that role, right? Empyreans are supposed to be demigods and candidates to godhood. So, given they're supposed to have people with such deific status, then the tutelary deities should fill that role. Now, the Curseblades, who, as I have theorized before, are descendants of the shunned Nox explorers, they had since become an elite fighting force, according to the description of Curseblade Mira. But they were enticed into becoming tutelary deities, and the ones who failed, quote-unquote failed, were imprisoned, while the ones who succeeded are all gone. Given these tutelary deities are described as withered ascetics who give off spirit, ash, then it's likely the means for becoming a tutelary deity involved fatal deprivation of some kind. Like the Curseblade items mention that in order to ascend from their mortal flesh into tutelary deities, yada yada yada. So, ascend from their mortal flesh, right? In their withered ascetics, they look starved to death. So, in order to attain this deific status akin to an Empyrean, they're supposed to ascend from their mortal flesh. They're supposed to die. So the Hornsent had an elite fighting force in the Curseblades, but they were since shunned, just like the Nox before them, and in the process of becoming a tutelary deity, they either succeed and die or fail and go to jails. Their shock troops were undone, and there are no tutelary deities left. The next instance of divide and conquer that we find in regards to the Crusades comes through the Inquisitors. Inquisitors were given golden tender horns, they are garbed in golden, and they use golden spells associated with the barbs of the Scadu tree, which also resemble rune arcs, rather than proper spiral spells. They are clearly more closely associated with the grace aspect of the Scadu tree than the original white spirals of the tower. And their golden hair indicates they are more than grace inclined, they're likely grace given. But their dark skin and full head of tangled horns indicate a connection to the aforementioned Curseblades. Now, the Grandam calls Marika a strumpet. Right? I had to Google this word, I know what it means now, and at first I thought she was just throwing some shade. Okay, no pun intended. The first time I used this phrasing, the pun wasn't intended, and I thought it was funny. I know it's not, but I didn't mean to use it again, just came out. So, yeah, Shadow Realm, throwing some shade. It's still not funny. The Graham, so yeah, I thought she was just talking shit about Marika, right? But there is a reason for the Grandam to call Marika that. The Grandam calls Marika strumpet because Marika mothered a whole generation of grace-given Curseblades with the tutelary deities, which she then transformed into inquisitors that would persecute their own people in her stead. What this also means is that in order for tutelary deities to ascend from their mortal flesh, they were probably subjected to death by Snoo. Yeah. Now, okay, this whole thing, it explains why Mesmer doesn't bother conquering the Tower of Belurat past the impenetrable thorns. Like, this is a question that I had why don't the Crusaders just conquer the tower? You know, like the bottom half is all fucked up, and then they create the Barrier of Thorns. So they're restricting access to the upper half of the tower, but why not just conquer it, right? Well, they don't have to conquer it because the upper half of the tower is already under their control. Besides the presence of grace-giving and grace-wielding inquisitors, this is also indicated by the golden trees found in that area, whose inlaid bodies are exclusively female and differ from the bodies summoned by the Gates ritual. Other hints include the presence of golden bolts and some warm stones, a rune arc placed in front of a tree, and a tree fragment placed in front of an altar, which is relevant because these fragments, they're described as the people of the Earth Tree collect these splinters and use them in prayers. So once you realize the Inquisitors work for Marika, not just work but are descended from Marika, they are her offspring. If you go back to the tower, the upper half of the tower, and just look around, it just makes sense. The whole place is grace fucking given. And the fact horned warriors in this area wear divine beast helms may also indicate that they are under the control of Mesmer's forces, given that the majority of divine beasts were killed by the crusade, and that the divine beasts themselves would be reanimated humanoid bodies, right? We see that in the boss fight. So the fact that the horned warriors in this area, this specific area, wear that helm might indicate they are also reanimated just like the boss, and the fact that the Crusaders had killed most of the divine beasts implies that they were reanimated by the Crusaders. And a couple of side notes. The Grandam title is reminiscent of the Shimanic grandmothers, and the fact both her and the Inquisitors are all female kinda tips Marika's hand in the formation of a more matriarchal state that reflects both her past and present. And the Horned Bairn, reminiscent of the Omen Bairns, states that most young born bearing the oversized horns meet a frightfully early demise, possibly indicating that male Cursed Blade descendants are killed at birth, which would explain what happens to the male counterparts of the Inquisitors, and is also in line with how Marika tends to treat people with horns. And lastly, like this isn't lore, but I think it's worth talking about, like we should take the time to contextualize Marika's strumpeting ways here. The Grandam, like, she passes judgment on Marika, but the game doesn't, and neither should we. Despite the veneer of simplicity cast by the story of Soulsborne games, we all know that's not the case, right? These stories and characters, they're not simple, they're not one-dimensional, and the female characters, they're no exception. Different characters throughout these games and these stories, they have found different ways to wield power, given their circumstances and their limitations. Like some just use brute force, others use political power, they can use knowledge, faith, manipulation. When it comes to strumpeting, in Dark Souls, Gwendolyn used her sister's sexuality to ensnare the chosen undead, and in Elden Ring, both Marika and Ranni use their sexuality as weapons of their own. Ranni entices the Tarnished into literally objectifying her body while puppeteering Seluvis. You know? Like, she's controlling Seluvis, and Seluvis entices the Tarnished into turning Ranni into a sex doll. But she does that in order to weed out those who are undeserving of her trust. She knows we're all going to be horny about that, and she uses that against us. In Marika herself, she uses her sexuality not in order to test, but to manipulate the men around her. Champions and warriors all serve under her command, and the strongest of them, they all get to sire children with her. And in the Shadow Realm, her sexuality broke down the patriarchy of the Horn Scent before the first blade of the Crusaders was ever drawn. And even if it wasn't about achieving any political goals, if it wasn't about the Crusades, even if she just wanted to snoo the fuck out of those tutelary deities, that's also no reason for anybody to judge Marika on those terms, right? That's her business, not ours. She can snoo whoever the fuck she wants. But with all that being said, I'm also not excusing Marika for her crimes, right? She's a genocidal maniac, and we should judge her on those terms. She has committed a lot of crimes, but strumpeting is certainly not one of them. Okay, moving on. Moving on. Another location of interest where Inquisitors can be found is the Abyss, which is, or at least used to be, associated with Marika, given the presence of the abandoned church there, which is, in turn, just a Church of Marika minus the statue. Like, the architecture is the same, the pedestal for the statue is there, there's even a Scadutree fragment in front of it. It's just the Church of Marika, even though it's missing the statue. The way into the Abyss is guarded by Jory, Elder Inquisitor, whose status as an Elder would make his position one of seniority, which was viewed as an asset, according to the Inquisitor Ashes. This position of seniority, of being an Elder, makes Jory an OG Inquisitor, right? And Jory is effectively spirit calling, summoning spirits during the boss fight. Ancient tower hexes are associated with spirit calling via the Bone Bow, and the Inquisitor Ashes also states that Inquisitors cast hexes, right? So ancient tower hexes are spirit calling, and Inquisitor Ashes say that Inquisitors cast hexes and Jory is effectively spirit calling. So they're all connected, and spirit calling is associated with Marika's own past as a spirit caller herself, at least according to my theories. And this whole spirit calling thing is also arguably associated with the horned warriors found in the manse, in Midra's manse. On the way to that manse, we also encounter the non-horn saint Marin Hand NPC. And the first thing to notice here is the fact that both the Inquisitors roaming the Abyss and the Marin Hand cast Frenzied Flame incantations, but they don't seem to be afflicted with frenzy, given that, unlike the commoners of the Frenzied Flame village, for instance, these ones, the Marin Hand and Inquisitors, they lack the fire coming out from their eyes and frenzied powers that aren't incantations, right? Like the fire is the first that giveaway of being afflicted with frenzy, and there are powers that are a bit more ambiguous, right? Like when you fight the commoners that are afflicted with frenzy flame, they will grab their heads and spew forth frenzy flame all over the place. But those can be powers that they are summoning from within. But the Marin Hand and Inquisitors, they don't do that. They only cast incantations. They produce the crest, right? These are spells, not intrinsic powers. And yeah, it kind of feels like intuitive at first that they would make use of such powers. One is called the Marin Hand, and the others, the Inquisitors, they are in the Abyss, and there's chaos all over the place. But, like I said, these aren't powers. They aren't afflicted with frenzy. They're casting spells. They have to have learned these spells in order to cast them, which makes the connection a bit deeper. And also, The Mating Hand NPC isn't using a Frenzied Flame seal. I think it's probably the Two Finger seal, but I'm not sure. But I am sure that's not a Frenzied Flame seal. Now, Nanaya's torch mentions a man who failed to become the Lord of Frenzied Flame, and that could be overlooked, but it arguably establishes a pattern when you take into consideration Midra's failure to become he became a Lord of Frenzied Flame, but he's not a Super Saiyan Lord of Frenzied Flame. You know, like when the Tarnished becomes a Lord of Frenzied Flame, we burn the world to the ground. You know, we burn down the Earth Tree and set the skies ablaze. Midra is objectively a failure in that regard. So the pattern would imply that Nanaya specializes in finding candidates that pose no actual threat, right? Like, she's either extremely incompetent at her job, or she's actively seeking out candidates that are willing to become Lords of Frenzied Flame, but unable to become proper Lords of Frenzied Flame. And finally, we should note that both Midra and Anaya were garbed in golden clothes, just like the golden adornments of the manse. Their clothes would imply a connection to Marika and her inquisitors swarming the area. The surprise of the spirit NPC who says, "Are we not brethren, common in our line? What crime did great Midra commit?" should help corroborate the idea of a previous collaboration between the manse and inquisitors, which is again compounded by the Frenzied Flame incantation casting, but not Frenzied Flame afflicted inquisitors in the area, and arguably also the floral landscape seen in the manse's painting, which is reminiscent of the festive traditions tacitly tolerated by the Earth Tree. Keeping in mind that Nanaya is specifically mentioned to have come from, quote-unquote, a distant land, like, you know, the lands between. So Midra and his cult, their goal is supposed to be one of summoning the Lord of Frenzied Flame and doing a Lord of Frenzied Flame ending in the Shadow Realm, just like we get in the lands between, but Nanaya would cast a veil of doubt on that by the pattern established through Midra's failure and the failure of the previous Lord of Frenzied Flame, whose spine she ripped out and carries around. And you get the Inquisitors in the area who are associated, they are an offspring of Marika, casting spells of Frenzied Flame, which would establish a connection between the cult and Inquisitors in the area. Had been previously connected to Marika through the Church of Marika, arguably through the landscape that was present there. And the Aged Ones, they drop swollen grapes that have been touched directly by the Three Fingers embrace, but there are no mentions of a Three Fingers existing in the Shadow Realm, which would further corroborate the idea of Marika's participation in the establishment of Midra's cult, since she had access to Lendel and the Three Fingers, and could have provided the swollen grapes to Midra, Nanaya, and their people. And lastly, the silver horn tenders dropped at the manse indicate at least some of its residents were nobles. And the implication is that Marika's non-horn scent Inquisitor allied agents, Nanaya and Midra, had enlisted a sect of Horn-Saint nobles into the worship of the Frenzied Flame, going as far as providing them with the aforementioned swollen grapes brought from the lands between. Why would they do that though, right? Well, Marika proceeded to immediately betray them, as is her wont, and branded them as dangerous enemies that needed to be prosecuted by the Inquisitors. They were allies at first. You have the Frenzied Flame casting Inquisitors roaming outside, and you have the non-Frenzied Flame casting Inquisitors inside the manse. Everybody there is dead. The Mating Hand NPC, who should be also apparently associated with this cult, with this sect, he wields the Mating Hand weapon, And within this context, he would be working with the Inquisition as well. And the victims mentioned in the Mating Hand weapon, like the Mating Hand NPC wouldn't count among the victims. The Mating Hand NPC would be the one producing the victims. And as soon as the persecution started, she also had her statue removed from the Church of America in order to distance herself from the inciting events. Like, during the phase of partnership between America and the Tower that we have been discussing, it would be easy to have the Inquisitors persecute the low-born pariahs of society, right? The commoners. And the best way to ensure they could expand their activities to encompass the more powerful and affluent members of Hornsaint society was to label them as terrorists. Fear is a powerful weapon, and accusations of involvement with Mithra sect, whether these were fabricated or not, could be cast upon anyone. Right? You have this period where they are working together, and Hornsaint nobles, of course, hold more power within the society. So, if you're advancing their goals and only persecuting the commoners, it's easy to get their support. Once you start persecuting the nobles themselves, then you kinda need a reason for it, right? You kinda need to justify your acts when you do that. And the best way to do it is to turn them against each other. Divide and conquer, baby. All the way. So now we gotta talk about the catacombs in the Shadow Realm. And in order to talk about the catacombs in the Shadow Realm, we're going to talk about the catacombs in the Lands Between. There are signs of eternal cities on the surface of the Lands Between that have been destroyed a long time ago, and the catacombs wouldn't have survived that level of destruction, meaning they are more recent than the eternal cities. But the roses depictions and the ghost flame motif, they also indicate that they were built before the rise of the Earth Tree. So given they came after the Eternal Cities, then they couldn't have been brought to the Shadow Realm by the original explorers, and since they predate the Earth Tree, they couldn't have been brought to the Shadow Realm before Marika's return, meaning Marika is the one most likely to have built them in the Shadow Realm. Their very architecture appears more modern than the ancient ruins of Raul and the jails, for instance. As further evidence for this conclusion, it's worth noting the latent similarities between the catacombs in the Shadow Realm and the Impaler's catacombs in the Lands Between, the presence of basilisk statues that would be tied to the Princes of Death, and the presence of vulgar militiamen, who were apparently given irises of grace, given their masks sport the glowing golden eyes. And now we go back to that Prince of Death crest timeline I had started on part 1. This is the complete chart and we're going to go by it in chronological order. And I highly recommend going back and watching part 1 if you haven't. And even if you have watched part 1, maybe rewatch this little bit regarding this timeline because it can get a little complicated, but last time we stopped on the third line on the story trailer when the Grandmother's Ritual created the first Ghost Flame Prince of Death of the Shadow Realm. Now, as an extension of this framework, it's worth noting that the Lands Between Tibia summons dropped by a mariner associated with those who live in death doesn't produce the Prince of Death crest, but is affected by the Prince of Death staff. The spell is affected by the staff because of the ancient Eternal Cities Princes of Death, and the association with those who live in death combined with the lack of a crest indicates this spell was developed during the Age of the Sun Realm and the rule of the Glowmite Queen, a period of time between the fall of the One Gods and the rise of the Golden Order. Now, back to the Shadow Realm, we have the Call of Tibia, the Spirit Weapons, and the Catacomb Mages. The Rings of Light spell draw from Ghost Flame, but, as previously discussed, these are spells developed by the colonizers, associated with grave birds who watch over spirit graves, which are, quote, the oldest gravestones that turn into spirits and then fade away, end quote. The oldest gravestones. The Call of Tibia is associated with the grave keepers and mariners, whose domain is home to physical gravestones, which are in turn more recent than spirit graves, right? The spirit graves, they are the oldest gravestones. The physical ones, they're not turning into spirits yet, so they're more recent. Now, considering there are mariner boats in the Shadow Keep, literal mariner boats in the Shadow Keep, and at both Karos Hidden Grave and the Cerulean Coast, where we can find the only Shadow Realm Mariner and the items associated with the Gravekeepers, are home to those piled up, hold-carved gravestones that are somewhat common in the lands between, but exclusive to these two locations, the Cerulean Coast and Karos Hidden Grave, and the Abyss in the Shadow Realm, with the Abyss having been previously associated with Marika. It's safe to assume that mariners of the Shadow Realm, the oldest of Gravekeepers, were not only brought from the lands between, they were brought by Marika. And it's also worth noting that, judging by the Gravekeeper's brain pain, the Gravekeepers weren't horn sent, right? Just a little side note there. And being an offshoot of the Tibia summons, which we have just discussed, the Call of Tibia doesn't produce the Prince of Death crest, but the spirit weapons found in these locations, they do, and so do the Catacomb Mages. Then, as the last chronological piece in this Prince of Death crest timeline, we have Fia's Mist, which is the only one to produce a golden Prince of Death crest. In the end, the Mist's crest, combined with the fact that it's the only death spell to inflict Death Blight, indicates that spell is explicitly associated with a grace-given Prince of Death. This, in turn, means that the spirit weapons and the Catacomb Mages' Ghost Flame Healed Prince of Death crests predate the Princes of Death in the Shadow Realm catacombs. And it also implies that the staff of the Prince of Death is likely an Eternal City original associated with the original kind of Prince of Death, the Ghost Flame Princes of Death. And the Sullied Amber embedded on it, on the staff, was a later addition, judging by the framework established here regarding which spells get the buff or not, and that, in turn, would make this staff reminiscent of the Staff of Loss, which is also missing a glintstone and is specifically associated with night spells. So now you have Gravekeepers brought by Marika setting up shop in locations disconnected from Hornsent society, right? Like the Gravekeepers, their domain seems to be primarily associated with the Cerulean Coast and Charon's Hidden Grave, and there's no Hornsent civilization there, right? And they're preaching that the dead have long been left to wander and that what they need is leadership. And wouldn't you know, Marika also built catacombs complete with Rosa statues to help lead the dead there, and where the dead would be grafted to the roots of the Skadu tree. This is a system instituted by Marika prior to the Crusades proper, to the invasion itself, and the creation of the grace-given Shadow Realm Princes of Death. And when it comes to the system's purpose, that plays out in stages. First, the creation of this new quote-unquote faith, spreading from the outskirts, plants a wedge between the higher and lower classes of Hornsent. the nobles of the tower still practice spiral magic and tie twigs to their grave markers as a sign of worship toward the Scadu tree itself. Meanwhile, commoners practice rancor summoning magic and fasten antlers to the grave markers as a sign that their worship had shifted toward a more spiritual path. And this shift is also hinted at by the fact that all skeletons inside catacombs are hornless. Like not all shadow people are horn-sent. You can see that, for example, in the Shadow Scholars. And then, this newfound spirituality helped to further fragment the people of the tower by bringing some of them around to the idea of tutelary deities, who are themselves associated with spirituality as well. And it also helped justify the building of the catacombs where Princes of Death could be grafted to the roots of the Scadu tree in the first place. So you have signs of Marika bringing mariners and gravekeepers and this new quote-unquote belief system and setting them up in the outskirts of Horn-Saint society. This new faith starts spreading throughout the commoners. Eventually it also helps bring the nobles around to the idea of tutelary deities, and those combined kind of create the drive, the momentum that allows her to build the catacombs, which can be justified by different reasons from both sides of Horn-Saint society, both the nobles and the commoners, but that serve Marika's own ulterior purposes, of course. And when the time came to begin the cleansing of the tower, all of that also helped to further fragment the commoners themselves. Like we had already created a wedge between nobles and commoners, then we started fragmenting the nobles of the tower, and now we can further fragment the commoners as well by bringing some of them around to the spirituality of Mesmer's flame. Ever since I read that, I found it was a weird quote, a weird way of referring to Mesmer's flame. But if a portion of the commoners had already been drawn to this new spiritual faith, then the spirituality of Mesmer's flame can be a way in for them to join the crusade, which is again exemplified by the Shadow Crusaders who are hornless and the Shadow Scholars who are hornless and that are currently stationed in the Shadow Keep. So that gives us the how, who, and why the catacombs were built in the Shadow Realm. At least on the surface, we still need to talk about Marika's ulterior motives, of course. But before we get to that, there are also the catacomb mages. Their importance for the theory at hand is the fact that they cast spells with Ghost Flame Healed POD crests, Prince of Death crests, right? Which is further associated with Marika and the whole faith thing that she's building through the spirit weapons, which also produce this crest and are associated with the Gravekeepers. But not only are these mages from the catacombs very, very interesting by themselves, they also solve a couple of the base game's lingering mysteries. So, what makes them so interesting? Well, they do cast Prince of Death spells that nobody else casts, and they don't even drop any of them. And they do it by using wands rather than staves or seals. And, come on, have you looked at them up close? They look like undead simian necromancers. Dumbledore-looking undead simian necromancers. That, I swear to God, kid you the fuck not, carry fucking undead babies tucked through their chests. You gotta really stop and look at them. It's not easy to notice, but once you do, holy shit. Why the fuck do they do that? Why are they like that? Why do they do that? Okay, so, as previously theorized, the catacombs were built by Marika. who was also importing gravekeepers and the like, so it's safe to assume she also imported these mages to staff the catacombs she built, right? She built the catacombs, she was bringing ghost flame related people to staff the fucking new religion, and she also brought these ones to staff the catacombs, right? Especially considering hybrids are much more prevalent in the lands between than in the Shadow Realm. Now, the very first thing that comes to mind when looking at all this, look at this picture. The first thing that comes to, at least to my mind, are the abductor virgins, right? I mean, just look at it. And as we move ahead, just keep in mind that the snake motif of the abductors would be tied to Mesmer, leader of Marika's forces in the Shadow Realm, and that their participation in this plot that we're getting into right now also explains their presence in the Shadow Realm to begin with, right? Everybody who's fought them was like, what the fuck are you doing here? Right? You should not be, why are you here? Well, looking at this scenario, looking at these mages and looking at the virgins, you might ask yourself, if the abductors were abducting these babies, then why are these hybrid necros still holding their babies? Well, there's another necro-inclined hybrid in the lands between, another hybrid with necromancy powers, that's notoriously missing their babies. And I'm speaking, of course, about the Harpies. Everybody has heard their singing, and for anyone who isn't aware of it, their Song of Lament has been translated. And it goes as follows. Unfortunately, that land once blessed now has diminished. We were destined to become mothers, now become tarnished. We lamented and shed tears, but no one consoles us. Golden One, at whom you were angry. So, this gives us necrohybrids who collectively were denied their motherhood and who blame a quote-unquote golden one for it. So, hybrids are historically tied to the age of the Crucible, and as I have explained before, that would have been the age ruled by the Glowmite Queen. And these Harpies were likely an intermediary clerical caste mediating the lowlands of the surface and Farum Azula, capital of the Sun Realm. All of this was explained in my Destined Death video. The Golden One, of course, implies Marika and Grace, who, given the context of the timeline we have established, were in the process of conquering the surface but hadn't yet taken Farum Azula itself. And the conclusion here is that Marika had seized the offspring and male counterparts of the Harpies and non-consensually relocated them to the Shadow Realm. Right? She gets a full staff of necromancers to work the Prince of Death grafting mines in the Shadow Realm, and also completely breaks a whole cast of the Glowmite Queen servants in a single move. Divide and conquer, baby. Pun intended, not intended, I'm sorry. And now, I mean, Harpies are just doomed to extinction, right? They have no more babies and no one to make new babies with. And to any Marika apologists still out there, I know you're out there, and I know it's not just a few of you, I'd like to point out that this is a literal act of genocide on top of her other acts of genocide. And yeah, I know I was a bit freaked out by the Dumbledores, but I'm just kind of sympathizing with them now. So yeah. Mystery solved. Genocide. Yay. Okay, moving on to the culmination of Marika's plans in the Shadow Realm. We get to the Skadu Tree. We've talked about the catacombs and the Prince of Death crest producing spells, but we haven't talked about the Princes of Death themselves. As I had previously theorized in my first series, the Prince of Death under Stormveil is older than Godwyn's Prince of Death, given its lack of eyes, which would indicate it's been trapped in a death-like state for a longer period of time, a feature that is shared by the Shadow Realm Princes of Death. Death Knights would seem to corroborate that as well, since they came to the Shadow Realm after Godwyn's transformation, which is indicated by the description of the Death Knight helm, which states, "The decayed golden wheel that adorns it represents their unbroken loyalty to Godwyn, he who became Prince of Death." And this detail would seem to corroborate that eyeless Princes of Death predate Godwyn, because Marika only had the One Ring during the Crusade, and as we have discussed at length before, and hadn't yet usurped the Elden Ring proper from the Glowmite Queen. Then Godwyn's transformation would have happened after the Crusades, since the goal of his sacrifice was to gestate a rune capable of granting the power of Destined Death to Marika's Elden Ring. This has been explained in my original series, but the too long didn't read version of it is that if Ranni hadn't sabotaged the Knight of Black Knives ritual, then Godwyn would have died a true death as a quote-unquote martyr to Destined Death, and he would have wielded a rune akin to a full-wheel curse mark of death, which could then be used to mend the Elden Ring and granted the power of Destined Death, which had been imprisoned by Marika but not yet assimilated. And as a side note to the ritual that created the Shadow Realm Princes of Death, Black Knight Commander Andreas and Captain Hu in the Scorpion River and Fog Rift Catacombs were likely sacrificed as the other half of that ritual, having died in body only, leaving their spirits behind, and eliminating those whose allegiance to grace, as a concept more than an entity, surpassed Marika and Grace's actual designs, right? They rose up against Mesmer. Mesmer was just following Marika's orders, but they were too headstrong in their fanaticism. They were too earnest in their faith toward grace to accommodate Marika's actual designs. Now, when the English descriptions related to Death Knights mention a Prince of Death's cadaver surrogate, the original Japanese descriptions imply these bodies share a connection between each other, and likely not in the metaphysical sense, but more likely in the literal sense instead. This connection could explain the sprouting of thorns all over Stormveil, for instance, since that Prince of Death would be connected to the Princes of Death grafted to the Skadu Tree. And it could possibly also explain the eyes present in Deathroot, which has always seemed weird to me. Why does Deathroot have eyes? Which would be derived from the missing eyes of Princes of Death, though this point is circumstantial. And, well, regardless, this connection is also important for the process of converting the Tree of Light into the Skadu Tree. And before moving on, just one more side note, this time regarding the Death Knights. They are intruders in the catacombs. The first impression that you get is that they belong there, like they're all part of the same gang, but the description of the Death Knight armor says that they were on a quest for the coming Age of the Duskborn, right? And the Age of the Duskborn is explicitly associated with Fia, and one of them was killed in the Darklight Catacombs. You can fight two of them in Scorpion River and Fog Rift, And the other catacomb, Darklight, also has a Death Knight, but it's dead. And like the bosses Death Knights that you fight, they drop Amber medallions. And when you loot the corpse of the Death Knight in Darklight, it will give you its armor, but not the medallion. But the medallion is there. It's just not on the body. The Viridian Amber medallion is in a chest in that same catacomb. So they bothered with looting the medallion off of the corpse, but didn't even bother enough to move the corpse. It's just laying there next to a pit. And like the decayed golden wheel that adorns their helms is possibly a representation of the full wheel curse mark Godwyn was supposed to gestate. So Fia is possibly manipulating them, probably lying to them a little bit. And their ancient Dragon Knight followers were apparently all killed as well. Like, they're mentioned in the Ancient Dragon Knights cookbooks, but there are none around to be found. So 2 Death Knights managed to make their way to the Princess of Death, but the other one didn't, and their followers were all murdered as well. Moving on, we have already discussed Ruined Forges and Altars of Light and Darkness in the context of their original application during the rise of the Hornsent against the Shamans, but they also served a different purpose in more modern times as well. Regarding the forges, the first thing to notice is that there's actually no way in on the buildings we enter through. Like, the entrances for all 3 forges had to be dug through a wall and then excavated into the underground. There's no door. This means the forges had all been sealed since the times when they were first used, and then someone had to purposefully dig their way in, and this someone was, as you might have guessed, Marika herself. The first most uncontroversial piece of evidence for this conclusion is the Hornsent spirit inside the lava intake ruined forge, who says, "By grace, if e'er I see another rock, I shall find it. Of this I have no doubt. The altar of the forge cannot be far." You know, someone is digging their way into these forges, and now we have a Hornsent loyal to Grace on a task to find an altar somewhere. And from there, we could also mention that there are Mesmer soldiers guarding the path to Tyleo's forge, and that are Misbegotten found around the entrance to all the forges. Misbegotten are more than likely from the lands between, and would have been brought as a workforce for the excavation. In the Starfall Forge, we can even see Misbegotten fighting the local golems and lava tears. So, what was Marika's interest in these forges? Well, her first application for them was to, forge. Mesmer's spear showcases Smith's Crypt technology. Like, it works like a Smith's Crypt spear. You can throw it and materialize another one on your hand. And it also has that attack that sprouts spears from the ground, like the Anvil hammer. And since Marika's hammer was made in the lands of the Newmen, outside the lands between, then it's likely the ruined forges were used in the crafting of that weapon as well. Now, besides that, there are also the altars that were originally located inside the structures, the altars of light and darkness. The quote-unquote altar of the forge mentioned by that spirit we just talked about is likely a reference to these altars, which is compounded by the fact that sword monuments in the lands between are stone-shifted swords, just like the one found in these altars, further connecting Marika to these altars, right? These altars have since been relocated, and one of them was conspicuously placed inside Marika's Fog Rift catacombs. Here, there's also the fact that one of her catacombs is named Darklight Catacombs, which is arguably a reference to the Altars of Light and Darkness. You see, there are 2 Princes of Death, but 3 catacombs. Fog Rift and Scorpion River lead directly to the roots of the Skadu tree, and the Princes of Death grafted to them. Darklight, on the other hand, leads to the Abyss. But the Abyss wasn't always accessible. Castle Ensis, which was arguably built by Mesmer and Marika, is a choke point that serves to control the flow between the higher and lower lands, keeping the people of the tower at bay. And the Shadow Keep serves to safeguard access to the Skadu tree on the surface, the importance of which will be explained at the end of the section. But both structures, besides being military structures, they also serve functionally as dams. This particular application is very blatant in regards to Ensis. Like, you can literally walk up to it and see the high wall they built and the water that was contained by it. It's just a dam. And in the Shadow Keep, this application isn't as clear, but it's also very easy to spot once you've been made aware of it, right? Like, they're obviously containing water up there. You can see the water flowing out of it when you unflood the church district, and when you look at the map, you can see that both the structures are containing waters that would be flowing toward the Abyss, meaning that area, the Abyss, used to be flooded but has since been drained. The implication, I believe, is that that was the first place where Marika had hoped to find the roots of the Skadu tree. There's a thick network of roots there that would probably have been known, since it was underwater rather than underground, so she drained it and built the Darklight Catacombs where she had hoped the first Prince of Death would be grafted. But apparently those roots weren't suitable for her needs, so she had to find another application for that place, and she later placed the altars inside the Fog Rift Catacombs instead. Okay, now, what's the point of these altars? Why did she go through the trouble of excavating and relocating them? Well, by combining the connection between these altars, which we have talked about, with the connection between the Princes of Death, which we have just talked about, then she can create a network that harvests and converts energy in order to infuse and eventually strangle the Tree of Light. The Fog Rift Catacombs would serve as an access point where energy could be transferred between the 2 networks. Then, by looking at Raul's altar, we see that it was built on top of a particular structure, and by looking at other examples of that same structure, we can discern its purpose. The other examples have a Raul burrow and a tutelary deity statue on top of them. The burrows function by harnessing white spiritual energy, as per the descriptions. In the center of the stone is a small nest-like hole. Once this is inhabited by a sprite, the stone can be used as a ritual implement, which is from Raul Burrow, and a ritual implement made to control explosions of spiritual power, used to cause a spiritual explosion consuming the sprite dwelling within Sprite Stone, which is from the Bone Stone. And the tutelary deities had revered spirit ashes quietly accumulate in the palm of their hands. So these structures seem to function by focusing spiritual energy that can then be harnessed by burrows, tutelary deities, or even altars of light and darkness. And regarding this particular altar in Raul, it's also worth noting that an invisible bridge was used to replace the collapsed stone bridge that led to this altar, to this place, indicating someone needed to have access to it, right? So we have Fogrift as a connection point, we have Raul as a focal point for white spiritual energy, and lastly, there's the altar in Unte. This location can only be accessed through the Shadow Keep, and Unte itself bears connections to both the Inquisitors and the Shaman village through the giant Golden Arc spell and the mini floral landscape contained within its walls. With the Shamans and the Inquisitors both have been associated with Marika. Now, the other major feature of this location is the presence of furnace golems. Quite a large number of them, actually, but Unte itself is quite small, right? So what would justify bringing so many golems to this specific place if there weren't that many people to burn? Well, the point wasn't to burn the people who were here. It's not big enough. One golem would do. The point was to bring the burning people from elsewhere, right? You're not just burning people who are here, you're bringing people from other places to burn here. So, this location is secluded enough to be safe from both scrutiny and interference, and it's also located on the path to the Darklight Catacombs, the original site where the Prince of Death system was supposed to be implemented. And like the hefty furnace pot says that the furnace's flame burns away both body and soul. So by having the golems burn the horn scent here, they could transfer their shadow energy to the altar in Unte and the system it is connected to. So the altar's network can convert the white spiritual energy and the dark shadow energy back and forth, and it is also connected to the Prince of Death network, which is infused with the gold of the grace given, and is graphed to the root system of the Tree of Light. With this system in place, they can siphon the spiritual energy out of the Tree of Light, either by simply converting it to shadow energy, or possibly by infusing another network with it, by which I mean the tutelary deity statues. Since there's no explicit explanation to why they would gather spirit ashes, or the most weird one, to why Sites of Grace would be able to make use of spirit ashes to begin with, right? There's never any reason given to why Sites of Grace would work with those items, but if they're coming from this system, then yeah, Sites of Grace suddenly are compatible with them. Then, after they siphon that spirit energy out, they can fill that void with both Shadow and Grace, and thus the Skado tree was born. But regardless of what Marika may have told the people of the tower, the purpose of the Skado tree isn't to harness Grace. This isn't an Earth tree. Marika's forces are growing actual Earth trees in other locations. The purpose of the Skado tree is to die. The Skado tree fragment says, "It is said that when the Skado tree crumbles from its core, that it will scatter across the entire realm of shadow. The people of the Earth tree collect the splinters and use them in prayer. The tree is expected to die, and the people of the Earth tree even pray for it. The Skado tree isn't being converted to Grace, Grace is leaking out of it. And the altars of light and darkness were acquired in ruined forges, and those forges, Smith's Crypt weapons, have an interesting dynamic with infusions. Their descriptions state that they are incompatible with Ashes of War that grant skills with an affinity. But that's not entirely true. Like, A Smith script X can be infused with a sacred affinity, for instance, so long as the Ash of War in question doesn't, buff the weapon as an after effect. Sacred Smith script X with Golden Vow? Sure. Sacred Smith script X with Sacred Blade? Not so much. They both grant the sacred affinity, but Sacred Blade has that glowing after effect. And I think this dynamic revolves around the implements used in granting affinities. In order to grant the sacred affinity, you need a whetstone knife and either a sanctified wet blade with a physical Ash of War or a golden type Ash of War. So, either the ashes already carry the sacred infusion, or you can sharpen the whetstone knife in a sanctified wet blade to temporarily grant the knife a sacred element that will be infused into the physical ashes of war. This means that in either case, the sacred element isn't really infused to the weapon itself. It's present on the ashes that are either coating the weapon or arguably etched onto it, given that a knife is used in the process. But when you use Sacred Blade, the weapon itself becomes golden and, as previously stated, Smith script weapons are incompatible with affinities. So now, finally, going back to the Scado tree, if Forge Altars were used to impart a similar feature to the tree, that would make it incompatible with the grace they're pumping into it. If you pump a tree full of grace, it becomes a grace-given tree along the lines of an earth tree. But if the Scado tree can't assimilate that grace, then it will just accumulate inside the tree until the bark starts breaking apart and the grace starts leaking out, eventually reaching a breaking point when the tree will crumble to its death. And that's how you make a Scado tree, and that's how you kill it. And we're almost done now, but before moving on to Mesmer and Miquella, I would like to say that poisoning the Scado tree with grace is eerily similar to the biological warfare that Marika waged against the ancient dragons of Farum Azula, which I had described in my Destined Death video, where I theorized that Marika had used the Prince of Death in Stormveil and the Deathroot in order to poison the ancient dragons with grace, a point made even more salient given that Princes of Death were involved in both instances. And going back real quick to the point I made in this section regarding the Shadowkeep safeguarding access to the Scado tree on the surface, I think the relevance of that fact has to do with the Scado tree chalice. Access to the Scado tree on the surface is kept behind the Shadowkeep, and we have the Scado tree chalice there. And such implements are used in the lands between to gather the Earth Tree's bounty as it falls to the ground, right? According to the crystal tiers. So here, it's safe to assume it's doing the same thing, but for the Scado tree instead. Now, first, it must be noted that the black gate preceding the chalice and the chalice itself both resemble the keep in material and color. Then, we must turn to Gaius, who, despite having been raised by the Carians, was both Mesmer's friend and the leader of his men, all of which combined indicates the chalice to have been built by the Crusade. But what would they be using this chalice for? Well, on one hand, it probably worked in tandem with Marika's efforts to ingratiate herself with the Horn Scent by pretending Scado tree worship was not only sanctioned but actually encouraged, as seen with the tree worship sanctum. But, as always, it also had an ulterior motive. The chalice has a set of roots growing out of it, and I believe these black roots to be connected to the black ceiling tree in Raoul, which wasn't an original feature of those ruins, the ceiling tree, judging by the broken floor around the spot where it was grown. And when the barrier of thorns is undone, a golden layer can be seen underneath the shadow that enveloped the tower. So, the chalice would not only be transferring both shadow and grace from one tree to another, it would also allow the ceiling tree to create the barrier of thorns itself, which is associated with the Scado tree too, through impenetrable thorns. And we've seen a similar dynamic playing out as well, haven't we? With chalices linked to trees and the burning of said trees to undo barriers of thorns. And as a final side note, a massacre seems to have taken place where we fight Gaius, but have you noticed there are no dead bodies there? The great swords and duelist great axes planted on the ground are lanes between weapons, with the axes in particular being associated with the base serpent, meaning these are the weapons of Mesmer's forces who have died there, and there are countless sets of armor of a kind we don't really see going around, and the bodies are all gone. Now, the crest on the chest piece of those armors is reminiscent of a symbol found inside the catacombs, and the wrist guards have thorns, both of which imply these soldiers were faithful to the Scado tree via Marika's new faith, the one guiding the dead to the catacombs she had built. And I think they may have been used as fertilizer for the ceiling tree. Judging by the blessed bone shards found around the chalice and the precedent presented by the perfumers tending to the minor earth tree beneath the Shadow Keep, which also has a number of blessed bone shards around it. Giving their allegiance, the soldiers' allegiance, they were either betrayed and murdered or tricked into thinking this was going to be a true death and willingly sacrificed. And regarding Mesmer, well, Mesmer dutifully carried out his mother's wishes and a full-scale genocide followed suit. And even though he curses at his mother at the very end, he also exonerated her image by becoming the symbol of the crusade. Even though he did it under direct orders from her, which means he could have been coerced into it, especially considering his loathing of those bereft of light seems to extend to himself, as exemplified by the line, "O lightless creature, embrace thine oblivion, as shall I." Although he had quote-unquote accepted his fate, which means he was fine with being a graceless tarnished, which makes sense considering he had all statues of Marika beheaded, although he did seclude himself with the single non-beheaded statue of her, which is also holding a baby. So yeah, there's not much to say about Mesmer except that he's a massive fucking bitch and the mummy issues run deep as fuck and he doesn't need a lore hunter. Mesmer needs therapy. That's all I have to say about the Crusade, about Marika's Crusade in the Shadow Realm. And I went into it expecting a lot more battle-related lore, especially considering the complete and in-depth battle plans that the base game had given us regarding Mikila's invasion of Celia, Town of Sorcery, which I laid out in my second Mikila video. But there was a lot more scheming and intriguing and politicking instead. And by the time the actual invasion started, the Hornsent society was already fractured and crumbling, and America's forces just blitzkrieged their way through their marathon of war crimes. Yeah. Okay. Before moving on to the final piece of the timeline, which is talking about Miquella, let's do another recap, shall we? Because a lot has been discussed already. Well, so now we have the Eternal Cities going through the Shadow Realm through Meteor as colonizers, pretending to work with the shamans, all the while planning to betray them and replace their one god, but the shamans went behind the colonizers, and along with the serpent they summoned Grace, ascended one of the grandmothers as a formless mother, and decided their own one god at the Tower of Belurat, at the Gate of Divinity, using the colonizers' own secret rite, and proceeded to oppressing the colonizers, who became the Hornsent and Curseblades during the Golden Crucible. Then the Hornsent and Curseblades used the Ruin Forges to revolt against the shamans, and once the shamans were deposed, the Formless Mother and Grace and Serpent and a number of shamans moved to the Eternal Cities as the Numen, where they married into the coming royal bloodline. They established a new society, which culminated with the Glowmite Queen taking power from the patriarchy and establishing a new matriarchy, which was eventually cut short by Marika rising up with Grace, getting the band back together, Formless Mother, Serpent, Grace, but the Formless Mother and the Serpent betrayed Grace. Marika established the Erdtree, and she married back into the same fucking bloodline, marrying Radagon with the Carrions and using Meteor again in order to reach the Shadow Realm again and going there as colonizers again. She pretended to work with the Hornsent this time, like the colonizers pretended to work with the shamans. Now a shaman descendant is pretending to work with the descendants of the colonizers. She then instituted the Inquisitors. She bred the Inquisitors out of the Hornsent and proceeded to fuck up the Tree of Light slash Shadow Tree of their formless one god once again, and took over the Gate of Divinity and the Tower of Belurat that they had used to summon Grace in the first place and kill their one god before. Alright? Alright. Okay. The cycles continue to expand forever. And now let's talk about Miquella. Okay, if we're going to do a Shadow of the Erdtree timeline, we have to talk about Miquella, right? We have finally moved out of ancient and ancient-ish history and moved to the present day, our involvement. Well, not our involvement, but our period in the Shadow Realm, right? Most of Miquella's lore has been covered already at this point by my theories, by my videos, but some points still need to be addressed. Okay, so first, regarding Mohg, despite what Sir Ansbach believes, the Omen was likely not charmed. Like, if Miquella could charm demigods, there would not have been a War of the Shattering, Morgoth wouldn't have sided with the Erdtree, and they wouldn't have had to kill Radahn in order to make him a consort. Miquella could just have solved all of those problems by charming the other demigods. And the DLC itself presents us with a counter-example to the idea Mohg could only be working for Miquella if he were under the influence of a charm via Miquella's NPC followers, some of who continue to serve the unalloyed demigod even after their charms have been broken. This idea that Moog had to be charmed robs Moog of his agency in rising up against his oppressors, meaning of course Marika and the Erdtree, and disregards the fact that for a disowned child whose very nature marks him for lifelong persecution, the prospect of becoming Miquela's consort and head of his own dynasty is incentive enough for him to side with his sibling. For the first time in his life he was accepted, not shunned. Miquela definitely lied to Moog, but Moog was not charmed. Regarding Radahn, there's not much to say at the moment. To be honest, I'm sorry. His fate as a consort adds an ulterior motive to Malenia's southward march, just like everything they do seems to have an ulterior motive to it. And his appearance, his physical appearance in the Shadow Realm, doesn't necessarily reflect what he may have looked like in his younger years, since he's possessing Moog's body and his original body had no feet. I have thoughts on his appearance in the Lands Between, but at least for now it's still an open question. So the full extent of the implications found here also remains to be seen. Regarding the cocoon, Miquela's cocoon, Miquela's stripping off his golden flesh in the Shadow Realm might lead one to believe the body in the cocoon does not belong to Miquela, right? Which would then likely lead one to draw a connection to the tutelary deities of the Shadow Realm, who are described as withered corpses, the same way Lyra refers to Miquela's withered arm. The thing is, those Shadow Realm bodies, the tutelary deities, don't look anything like the body in the cocoon, even though we only have an arm to compare. Also, they are long dead, long enough to have become mummified, sort of, and the body in the cocoon is a bit too limber for it to be one of those, and that compounds with the fact Gideon believes the body to be of Miquela. Not to mention the question posed by the acquisition of a Horn-Sent tutelary deity's body prior to going in the Shadow Realm. Right? If that was a Shadow Realm body, how would Miquela get that body to get to the Shadow Realm? It's an unsolvable conundrum. So it's probably not a tutelary deity. But is it Miquela? Well, when it comes to Miquela in the Shadow Realm, he's probably not discarding literal pieces of flesh. There are Imperium blood burgeons around his crosses, but the manifestations of Rennala and Margit can also be bled, for instance. And the game has a plethora of flesh and limb-related items that indicate they could have added a Miquela's arm or eye somewhere, but they didn't. And some of the crosses show he wasn't just leaving behind supposed body parts, but also things such as doubt, fear, and love. Not to mention that, unless Miquela and Trina were conjoined twins, which they weren't, then the crosses regarding Miquela discarding her, Trina, definitely do not reference discarding his literal flesh. And Trina having a head of her own definitely doesn't mean Miquela discarded his literal physical head. You know, so he's not discarding literal pieces of golden flesh, which makes it possible for the body in the cocoon to still be his physical body, his original physical body. Shadow Realm larval tears hint at a similar condition when it says, neither flesh nor spirit, but something in between. And this last point regarding the larval tears also takes into consideration Miquela and Trina's possible self-rebirthing powers and its association with Lands Between larval tears, which could also be associated to the location where we find Trina as well. All of which combined, means the original conclusion that the body in the cocoon is Miquela is still true, and the body in the cocoon is Miquela. Regarding Mesmer's kindling, this one is possibly the one that's going to be contentious here. The mentions of original sin and a younger sister who bore a vision of fire seem to be blatant references to Melina, but it's likely a reference to Miquella instead. First, it must needs be remarked that original and first cardinal sins are two distinct concepts, right? The original sin is the first sin, and in the context of the Gate of Divinity, that would have been the betrayal committed by the Grandmother spurred by the base serpent. For the one God knows that when you consume it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like the one God, knowing grace and shadow. Genesis 3:5. While the first cardinal sin is the greatest sin one can commit, which in this case would be the burning of the earth tree. So yeah, the first cardinal sin, which we associate with Melina and the burning of the earth tree, and the original sin, which is something else. Also, the base game's reference to Melina as kindling and as someone who has envisioned flame are related to rekindling the Forge of Giants, but one can perform the same ritual without her assistance. Then there's also the fact that Miquella is Trina and Trina is Miquella. Miquella's gender in child form is inconclusive. Miquella is referenced as a male by Malenia and Lyra's dialogues, and Trina as a female by the Saint Trina's Blossom and again Lyra's dialogue. All this implies Miquella shifted between genders as he shifted between identities, probably employing the powers related to the power of rebirth, which is exemplified by Renala's Amber Egg in Marika when she shifts between herself and Radagon, which is compounded by the association between the Eternal City's larval tears necessary for rebirth and the Stone Coffin Fissure where Miquella discarded his Trina half. And with all that in mind, it's worth noting all other Empyreans are female, right? Miquella's an Empyrean. All Empyreans we have a record of, they're all female. Lens between Empyreans, at least. And that the body growing out of the Halig tree where the cocoon had previously been grafted has breasts. Like in Malenia's arena, there's that hole in the tree where the cocoon was probably etched into, given the presence of the cocoons littering the Halig tree. And there's a body kind of growing out of the tree itself, and the body has breasts. All of which indicates Miquella is our first Soulsborne trans character! Yay! A trans man, to be more precise. Everybody wants the first Soulsborne trans character to be Gwendolyn, but I'm sorry, the evidence just doesn't bear that conclusion out. Miquella was a cis girl. Gwendolyn was a cis girl. Meaning, Mesmer's kindling would be a reference to Miquella's gender as it was assigned at birth a female Empyrean, which, of course, also fits Marika's matriarchal designs. And finally, there's the Sealing Tree. There are just so many questions revolving around the kindling and Miquella in the tree. The first problem here is that Miquella went to the upper half of the tower before we did, but he didn't burn the tree to do so. He did go to Raoul, judging by one of his crosses found there, but he didn't burn the tree, right? The tree's there, the thorns are there, so he needed access to the tree, but he didn't have to burn it down. And even without burning it, how would he even use the tree to access the tower? Like, the kindling mentions bearing a vision of fire, which in the context of Miquella could be a reference to the accursed blood he infused his body with and the blood flame of the Formless Mother. But if that were the case, then why did Miquella go to Mesmer to begin with? Like, sure, one needs to traverse the Shadow Keep in order to access the West Rampart, which leads to Raoul in the tree. But there's a Mikila's cross on the storehouse 4th floor, which could mean Mikila was looking for the secret right scroll, but Mikila arguably knew about the right beforehand. Like, his entire plan hinged on it, he knew about it, that's what he was going for, right? So it's more likely to mean he went to Mesmer instead, that's where that path leads to. He needed Mesmer's flame in order to use the tree, in order to get to the tower and the gate. And something that helps to corroborate this point that Mikila went to Mesmer is the breaking of Mikila's Great Rune. I mean, how does one even break a Great Rune, right? And why did it break there? Well, Marika's hammer shattered the Elden Ring, and given that hammer was made in the same forges that made Mesmer's spear, then it stands to reason that said spear would be able to shatter a Great Rune, right? Mikila had abandoned his golden flesh, and Mesmer's purpose remains unchanged. Those stripped of the grace of gold shall all meet death in the embrace of Mesmer's flame. So, according to Fire Serpent, Mesmer's flame couldn't find purchase within his Fire Knights, but Mikila is an Empyrean, flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone, and he appeared in the Dark Chamber, graceless, and goaded Mesmer into striking him down. The purposeful breaking of his Great Rune also gives more context to the DLC NPCs whom he had guided to the Shadow Realm to aid him if necessary, since he was abandoning such a great source of power, and since the charms would be broken, he specifically brought Lyra along to kill anyone who didn't follow his orders afterwards. Right? Right. And finally, regarding Mikila's ascension. God is slain and we have killed him, you and I. Or have we? The thing about the God slain message is that we get that same message upon defeating the Elden Beast. And the Elden Beast is just an avatar of grace. The beast is dead, but the altar god is still out there. This would imply that that which we have killed was also just an avatar of Mikila, rather than Mikila himself. This is possibly corroborated by Light of Mikila. Like, the English description says, Mikila sought to accept all that was and would be, but found one that refused to be embraced. No wonder, as one god and one king consort is all the world needs. Which is a weird fucking description. And as always, I'm not fluent in Japanese, but the second sentence in particular seems to have been butchered in translation. I think this could be better translated as something along the lines of Mikila wanted to accept and embrace everything, but he knew one thing he couldn't do. The Absolute God and his Lord would never stand side by side. I have noticed Japanese lore hunters are having some trouble discerning the meaning of this description as well. They go with a phrasing that is like this one that I'm using here, but it is just as hard for them to get the meaning of it as it is for us to get the meaning of the English description. They're both too fucking cryptic. But if we take into consideration the possibility that the Mikila we fought was merely an avatar, then this description suddenly makes sense, doesn't it? The God and the Lord can't be together because the God has ascended to another plane, and the Lord was left behind. They could never stand side by side. So, in the end, every great one loses its consort. The demigod is dead, long live the outer god, forever fucking more. Alright, that's the timeline for the Shadow of the Erdtree. And I think it's worth making just one last recap and taking the full picture in, right? And before we do that, before we add Mikela to the timeline here, I wanna mention that Mikela seems to be kind of like a mirror of Marika. Like, Marika is a trad queen. You know, she's all like, fuck Melina, fuck the Glowmite Queen and all her death and death bullshit. We need to go back to shamanism. She dresses like the grandmothers, and she associates with the Formless Mother and Grace during the rise against the Glowmite Queen. And she makes this grand alliance with all these outcasts, and she goes on a southward march. And once all is said and done, she's just like, fuck you, got mine, you know, fuck everybody. It's just Grace, it's just me now. And Mikela is a trad king. He's like, no, fuck Marika, you know, fuck the current establishment, fuck Marika. We need to go back to Grace, like unalloyed gold, bitch. And he makes this grand alliance with all these outcasts, and then Malenia goes on her southward march, and at the end of it, Mikela is just like, fuck you, got mine, you know, fuck everybody, I don't care, it's me, I'll charm all of you, you know? So yeah, let's do the full Mikela recap. So as seen in the last recap, we had the Eternal Cities people going to the Shadow Realm and starting some shit with the Shadow Realm people, who then went back to the Eternal Cities and started some shit with the Eternal Cities people. And then we had them going back to the Shadow Realm and starting some shit with the descendants of the Eternal Cities people there. It's like a cycle of cycles. And now we have Mikela. And just like the Formless Mother had come from the Shadow Realm to the Lands Between, Mikela uses the Formless Mother in order to go from the Lands Between to the Shadow Realm. And just like everybody before, he pretended to work with the locals, he pretended to work with the Hornsent. And just like everybody else before, he went for the Gate of Divinity, the Tower of Belurat. And just like it had happened before, he married back into the Carians. Man, like, it's just cycles, man. And he was fake working with the Formless Mother and Moog, but Mikela doesn't seem like the kind to share power, just like everybody else who is fighting for power in this story. So he's probably going into another cycle of goddamn Dayside, you know? And along with Grace, well, the Formless Mother, she's back on the menu, boys. Okay, so that's the end of that. I think I covered everything I wanted to, everything that belongs in the timeline. I still have about, I don't know, 3, maybe 4 videos, 5 videos that I want to make regarding Elden Ring. With subjects that are related to both the base game and the DLC. But we'll get to that. For now, this one is done. And yeah, I hope it made sense to everybody. I hope the explanations are clear enough and the diagrams helped enough. And yeah, thank you all very much for watching, as always. A very special thank you to all of my wonderful patrons: Sinclair Lore, Balam, The Vampire, Sam D, Hubal, Taylor Reed, Medium Hat Logan, Derp, Devo, Brain Douche, Mr. Pudding, and Kyle Van Reaper. Thank you guys very much for the support and the patience. And yeah, until next time, everybody, stay safe and I'll see you around. Bye.